Whenever you're working around these saws, you have to be totally aware that these are sharp. I mean, that's their whole purpose, is to cut things. And if you put your hands on the teeth, you know, there's a very high likelihood of you being cut. So I'm always very conscious of where I've got my hands. And so when I'm holding onto the saw, I'll put my fingers between the gullet so that you know, there's no chance of my fingers actually getting mixed up with the teeth themselves. Of course, you have to be careful in putting your hands in the gullet that you don't come down on a tooth and get your fingers, so I put them in from the side. One safety issue, when you're tilting a bench like this, it's very important that you hang onto the saw whenever you loosen either end of the wing nuts. Because if you had forgotten, say, for example, to tighten that one, and you're thinking that it's tight, and if you loosen this one, and if your saw is slightly overbalanced, what can happen is that this can tip, and if your saw is not held tightly in the bench, it can actually throw the saw at you. Or if, on the other hand, your saw is slightly tilted this way, of course it'll tip the other way and may throw the saw on the floor. So whenever you're loosening either end of the bench, be sure that you hang onto the saw or the vise so that there's no chance for that happening. Now, the jointing is the process by which the teeth are all made to be the same height. Now, in a saw that has an arc to it, the question arises, what is the height of the tooth? How do you describe that? Well, most of the two-person saws like this are shaped on the arc of a circle. And so when I'm referring to and talking about the height of a tooth, that refers to the point on that circle that each of these teeth lies. In essence, what you do is you take a huge circle of metal and cut the tooth shapes out of it. And so what the jointing process is making sure that all of the teeth lie on what's known as the circle of the saw. Now, for one-person saws and for a few of the two-person saws, the teeth actually don't lie on the arc of a circle, and you have to use a different jointing process, and I'm going to initially show you here. The tool that I'll be using for jointing is a long jointer. This particular one is known as a Gibbs jointer, and it's comprised of two shoes and a file. The way this tool is used is that I'll put it on the saw in a relatively arbitrary place. It really doesn't matter too much where you initially adjust the tool, and what I'll do is loosen the wing nuts that hold the two shoes, generally with the file spanning two sets of cutter teeth, and then I'll tighten up the wing nuts holding the shoes, and that should presumably make it so that the two shoes and the file, all three, are hitting the teeth. Now, one of the idiosyncrasies of the Gibbs jointer is that the process of tightening up these wing nuts can actually change the adjustment on their height, and so you have to test it and make sure that hasn't happened. And the way of doing it is, if your file is just touching your cutter teeth, you should feel it and hear it actually hitting the teeth. Now, what I have done is I've adjusted this tool so that it's adjusted for this particular point on the saw. Now, one of the things that you need to know about how the long jointer works is that there are 3 points in contact with the saw, and 3 points define a particular arc of a circle. The objective in this exercise is to take all your high teeth down to where the level of the saw is just at the lowest spot on the saw. And if I adjust it initially for the low spot, then I'll be taking the whole saw down, not only the high spots, but also the low spots, which I want to avoid. So what I do is make sure that it's touching here, and then I'll move the jointer to several other spots on the saw and see if the jointer is still adjusted properly. Now you're going to run into a lot of saws, in fact most saws, that unless they were properly jointed will have waves in them. That is, the arc of the saw will be variable. It won't be on a circle. Some spots will be high, some spots will be low. And so I want to make sure that this is set up or adjusted for a reasonably high spot on the saw. So I'll put it here and I'll see if it's touching. Okay, this file is still touching. You can hear it. You can hear it touching, and I can also feel it. And then I try to rock the tool on the file and see if it rocks. Well, it's not rocking here, so the circle of the saw was precisely the same as it was in the center. Now I come down here. Okay, it's touching for sure, but now I rock the tool back and forth, and you can see it's actually rotating this way on the high spot. So I know that this spot is a little bit higher than the spot where I initially adjusted it. So I make a mental note of that. This spot is higher than that spot. And I'll go on down here. This also is a little bit higher than the spot where I initially adjusted it. Okay, here, this situation, the file is not touching the teeth at all, which means that this is a relatively low spot. So what I will do, once I've gotten a rough idea of the shape of the saw, I'll come back to the high spot. I'll go off to the side just a little bit, and now I'll readjust my jointer so that, again, all 3 points are in contact with the saw. It's not rocking anymore. Now what I've done is, is readjust the jointer to a higher spot on the saw. Now back here, because I've adjusted the file a little bit higher, I'm actually not touching anything, which is as it should be, because this is a low spot and I don't want to be taking metal off of that. Now it's really common when you get your jointer down here to the end teeth like this, that your file will not hit the teeth because of the way a saw wears. Your middle teeth always wear faster than the end teeth, and so your end teeth naturally are longer or higher than teeth which are closer to the center, and that will tend to lift this shoe up and take the file off the teeth so you don't have contact with it. I've tested one end of the saw, and now I'll take the jointer down here and do the same thing on the other end of the saw. Okay, here you can tell by the sound and the feel of it. Again, I'm not touching these teeth with the file, and presumably it's because the end teeth are slightly long. As I move the jointer up the saw, okay, here I just feel it, and you can hear it just touching the file a little bit, so this file will joint down these teeth. I'm not hitting here, I am hitting here, I'm hitting here, not hitting here. So the jointer for an initial pass is well adjusted because I'm hitting some spots which are high and I'm avoiding other spots which are necessarily low. Okay, once I've got the jointer adjusted to my satisfaction, now I do the jointing process. And for this, it's a good idea on your jointer hand to wear a glove. And the reason I do this is because as you're jointing, there's a possibility, faint but possible, that your jointer can actually slide off of the saw. And you can see that if you have your hand over the edge of the file and you slide off the saw, that you can get this nice fleshy part of your hand mixed up with the teeth of the saw. It's also important really to have your hand back from the edge of the file so that if it does slide off, then there's just not a chance physically for your hand to get mixed up with the teeth. So that being said, what I normally do is, knowing that these end teeth are almost always long, with the jointer what I'll do is take a few extra licks on the end teeth to shorten them down a little bit, and then I'll run from one end of the saw to the other. Like that, and you can hear where the file is grabbing and where it's not. And then what I'll do when I come back, I'll do the same thing on this end of the saw. I'll take these end teeth down a little bit and then return back with my jointer on the other side of the saw. Now the reason I want to go down on one side of the saw and come back on the other, it's important that your teeth are the same height on both sides of the saw. If for some reason the file in your jointer is not quite square to the rails that fit against the saw, then if you were to go down only one side, then because of the tilt of the file, the teeth on one side would be slightly longer or shorter than the other side. Another reason is that these saws are tapered. That is, they're thicker along the toothed edge than they are on the back. Now what that does is it generates an angle in the saw. The saw is actually a wedge, which will cause your jointer to tilt a little bit. And so again, consequently, if you were just to run the jointer on one side of the saw, then the teeth on one side would be shorter than the teeth on the other side. As I'm jointing, I'll joint from one end of the saw to the other, like this. And then after each time I run the jointer back and forth across the saw, I'll check to see what my progress is, to see if I've got those bright spots caused by the flat spots on each of the cutter teeth. See, the bright spot that I see is actually generated by a flat spot that's created by the jointer here. So I'll do that each time I pass the jointer back and forth over the saw. I'll check for the bright spots on the teeth to make sure that I jointed it down to the right height. Now there's some situations that you'll run into where you've got a tooth that's for some reason been broken or is extremely short relative to the other teeth on the saw. And I don't worry about jointing down to that, because there's no reason to take very much life out of a saw just to joint it down to one particular tooth. Because these saws, well, they're not making these saws anymore. And so you want to extend the life of them as much as possible. And when I'm jointing a saw, I find that normally I don't take more than about 10/1000ths of an inch of metal off of the saw each time I joint it. Your primary objective in the jointing is to get your cutter teeth all the same height, but a secondary objective is to make sure that your raker teeth are high enough that you can swedge them over. And what that means is that the tips of your rakers really need to be also touched with the jointer. Because if you have a saw that somebody else has filed and has for some reason made the rakers quite short, and you joint the saw thinking that, okay, we're done, all the cutter teeth have been hit, and now subsequently you go to fit your rakers up and you find that they're too short to do anything with, then you're going to have to continue jointing the saw until you get down to where your rakers are long enough that you can fit them up and make them work. And some saws, you may end up having to joint a long ways, and you just have to joint it down until things are, until your teeth are even. Ideally, you have a long jointer to shape the saw with, because that results in the best shape of saw. But these are not a real common jointer, and the jointer that most people will have is a short jointer Now this particular jointer is part of a combination tool, but basically what it is just a tool that holds the file square to the saw. And the way this functions is you start at one end of the saw, just like with the long jointer, and you run the jointer along the saw. And then you come back on the other side, just like with the long jointer. And it serves the same purpose to even up the height of the teeth. Now the disadvantage of the short jointer is that it won't compensate for waves that have developed in the saw over time, because it's so short, and it follows the waves, any waves that might be in the saw. But what it does do is that it evens up the teeth in each individual set of teeth. Now, one of the important things to use with a short jointer to maximize your keeping the saw as even as possible is to use the same pressure from one end of the saw to the other. And that way, you'll do as much as you can to retain the original shape of the saw.